The Origins podcast is now a part of the Origins Project Foundation. Please consider supporting the podcast and the foundation by going to www.originsprojectfoundation.org.
Hi, and welcome to the Origins podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. In this episode, I have a delightful conversation with paleoanthropologist Ian Tattersall, who's one of the world's experts on human evolution, has written a number of wonderful popular books, and was also curator of the Museum of Natural History in New York's exhibition on human evolution. It was controversial for obvious reasons, I guess, and it's a wonderful exhibit. But more than that, he's actually interested in many things, and one of the things we talk about is his fascination with the natural history of beer, among other things. So I hope you'll enjoy listening to my discussion with Ian in this episode of the Origins podcast. Ian, it's nice to be with you again, and I've often learned more about my species from you than others, and I hope to today. I want to start with, as we talk about human origins, I want to talk about your human origins, not all the way back, but what got you interested in studying hominids in the first place?
Basically, I stumbled into it. I think that basically the only honest way to discover anything is by accident.
Yeah.
And I was raised in Kenya. I was in boarding school in Nairobi when the Leakeys were making their big discoveries. In Olduvai Gorge, but I was in blissful ignorance of all of that. And it was only when I got to college that I discovered that there was an area of anthropology that was biological. And I fell into it, and very happily so.
What were you doing in Kenya? Your father or mother was there was it just a posting, or were they?
No, I think that after the end of the Second World War, and for a decade and a half at least after that, Britain was a pretty depressed and gray place, and my father very cleverly discovered he could have a much better lifestyle in the colonies, and he could do that because he was already working for London University, and he got a job at the University College of East Africa in Kampala in Uganda, where they were giving London degrees, so he could go there without burning his bridges.
Oh, fascinating. So what kind of academic was he?
Well, he actually was an administrator. He was a classicist by origin, but an administrator at the time. And so he ran the administration until independence hove into view, and it was time to go back to Britain.
Did you ever think you're doing classics? I mean, that's a little bit of the way back towards human origins, but...
No, I never thought of doing classics. I was signally bad at Latin, and I might have been discouraged from zoology if I'd known that we used Latin names a lot.
Yeah. When did you decide that sort of focusing on early modern humans, or if you want to call it that, was too fascinating to give up?
Well, that was a very gradual process. I went to college to study anthropology, basically because I already had some sort of background in the areas where many anthropologists used to go. And I was, my experience with anthropology was with the cultural end of it.
Yeah.
And only later did I discover there was biology, and I much preferred the biology.
It's interesting to me when I hear you say that, because one of the things we're going to talk about is in your one of your new books, Accidental Homo Sapiens. In some sense, you say ultimately that when it comes to Homo sapiens, it's culture rather than biology that really matters.
Well, that's absolutely right. That's certainly what makes human beings different. Certainly the way they use culture. And I was guilty, actually, couple of decades ago now, of writing in a book that there wasn't really anything that we could learn about ourselves from looking at our past. We couldn't learn perfectly well from looking around ourselves, at ourselves today. And that was a pretty disreputable thing for a paleoanthropologist to say. Yeah. But I still believe it to some extent. And I think that in studying paleoanthropology, what we're doing is answering something very deep in ourselves that we acquired quite recently.
And in a cosmic or geological sense. I mean, I've run workshops through our Origins project, and one of the ones where I learned a tremendous amount was one where we did on the origins of human uniqueness, which is really partly the subject of your new book and what makes humans unique. At the time, I found it fascinating because we invited geneticists and anthropologists,
I remember well,
and paleontologists, economists. All sorts of people, and it reminded me of that famous story about the people in the elephant. The geneticists said it was genetics that made them. The economists, and everyone seemed to find a different reason. And it was it's still it's a fascinating topic. But at the same time, what's sort of remarkable is how early humans were 30 or 40,000 years ago. And when you look at their cave drawings, and remarkably modern.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's an astonishing thing there because we're looking back quite a long way in time in historical terms. But we don't have to look back very far before we find creatures that are completely different from us. I think that for the first several million years of human evolution, early humans had been sort of extrapolations of what had gone before, but at about sometime under 100,000 years ago, there was a complete revolution in the way that humans were interacting with the world. And oddly enough, that was already 100,000 years after people who looked just like us had been around on the landscape. Our species was born 200,000 years ago, but it didn't start acting in the way in which we act today until much later.
And that are the species that look just like us. Are you talking about Neanderthals or
no? I'm talking about Homo sapiens, modern humans.
Early modern humans.
Neanderthals were actually quite considerably different from us in the way they appeared.
Yes, and maybe we'll find out. Although I was reading your book, and it seemed a little concerned about the ethics of producing some Neanderthals today.
I don't think we would want to even go there. I think one of the points that was raised at that Origins event that you mentioned, was somebody asked, well, what would happen if we cloned a Neanderthal?
Yeah,
and the first thing that occurred to me was, well, how would we know how to bring it up as a Neanderthal? So much of us is what we learn. If anybody one of us were sort of brought up in a black box, we would be very, very different creatures from the ones we turned out to be.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thrust that I get from your new book is how much of what makes us is not hardwired in a sense biology in the sense that we. The very basis of most of our civilization, including things that people think of as intrinsic aspects of our psychology, really come through culture, through the experience of being human. And the experience of being human involves being brought up in a human culture, one or another.
Exactly, yeah.
Of course, because I grew up at a different time, I was trying to figure out when species seem to have a different meaning. I was always told species were things that couldn't mate and produce, productive offspring. Yep. But then, of course, I know that I have Neanderthal genes and you do, and clearly, then these two species, Neanderthals and humans, did at least for a while were able to mate effectively, and so it always confused me, this notion of species. And I wonder, just recently, I see a new branch on the hominid tree was claimed to be discovered. And I'm just wondering whether I should believe any of that. I just wonder if you have one or two samples of individuals that look very different, and your book is all about the bell curve. But let me give you the hypothetical that I often think of. If I were watching a basketball game, and the roof caved in, and all of us in the audience died, as did the basketball players, and then a long time in the future, some anthropologists or paleontologists came and dug it up and found a basketball player and me, I'm sure they would say we were different species, don't you think?
I'm not sure that they would. There's something very distinctive about our species, Homo sapiens, that makes it different from all the other species that we know of in the fossil record. I think one thing that we have to bear in mind when you're pondering the kind of question, which is really an important question that you have been pondering, is that every species has to descend from another species.
Yeah.
That's the only way you get new species is through descent like that. That means that when they're newly separated, species are very closely related. And if they're very closely related, that means that there's probably some degree of genetic compatibility. And often what separates species is the way they behave, the way they recognize potential partners and so on. So it's not really surprising that early on in the history of closely related species, that if they come into contact, and in order to speciate, they have to be separated in some way, and if they come into contact, then there will be some minor degree of interbreeding. But what happened in the case of Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals was that Homo sapiens went on its merry way to become the species that we know today. And that the Neanderthals went on to become extinct pretty much identifiably themselves. So that these were two populations on different historical trajectories, as it were. And yes, they may have been closely related, and yes, they may well have exchanged a gene or two, but it didn't make a lot of long-term difference in terms of their evolutionary fate or even their ecological roles.
Well, then these other hominid species that have been discovered recently from how do I say it?
Denisova.
Yeah, Denisovans. And to, I don't know what this new one's called. That's just been another...
Luzonensis.
Yeah. And
cool.
So what do you make of this? And were they contemporaries or... and what do you make of that, of how the human tree, the hominid tree has changed? Let me put it a different way. So one of the wonderful things you've done, and among many, is create, I think, the Hall of Human Origins at the Museum of Natural History in New York, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, for the most part, except for a little bit of religion there that I didn't.
We all have our opinions about that.
How much would have changed since that's been developed? How much with these new discoveries? Do they change everything, or are they just small, minor alterations?
One of the big problems when you do an exhibition hall like that is you're spending a lot of money, and you're not going to be able to spend that kind of money again anytime in the near future. So you have to sort of obsolescence proof it as well as you can. But the issue then is that that means leaving out a lot of stuff. You have to decide to talk about things that you think are going to be relatively durable. And that, means leaving out all the interesting things du jour that you may have. And that's always a quandary that you have in a museum exhibit. But once it's in there, the chances that it's going to be materially changed over its lifetime are slim to none. If you had
the chance now, what would you change in that?
There is a lot that I would change, mainly because that was a designer's hall.
Oh, I see.
When we did its predecessor, the Hall of Human Biology and Evolution, the world was a very different place, and a curator and a designer had to negotiate to come up with a final result. And you might have disagreed, but it was a sort of a face-to-face thing, and you had to come up with a result that made everybody happy. Now, as in virtually every area of human experience, things are done by committee. And so I feel much less of a sense of authorship in this hall than I did in the predecessor hall. But things have moved forward, and the reason why we have the new hall, which is not so new anymore, is that things have changed a lot, and particularly the administration of the museum wanted the molecular story. To be told, and that was when they co-opted my colleague Rob Tattersall as a co-curator of the hall, and that's when we started our long collaboration, which resulted in this book
and a couple of books that come out recently.
10 or 12, I think.
Wow, it's amazing. It's funny because from the public's perspective, part of the hoopla about it was the explicit notion of evolution as being in a time in which evolution was being confronted, or natural selection and evolution being confronted in the schools and in politics. And so I remember at the time it was like, this actually, instead of, makes it explicit.
Well, we've never really been afraid of confronting that. And frankly, in New York City, we're in a relatively receptive place. We're not really on the front lines of that particular battle at the museum. But we've never been afraid to confront this kind of thing. Back in 1984, one of the most exciting things that I've ever done in my lifetime was to be a co-curator of an exhibit of original human fossils, in which we brought in original fossils from all around the world. I think we had 19 different countries and 50 or 60 different fossils from 19 countries in that exhibit. And we were really worried. We had security issues, and we consulted with Chemical Bank, as it was in those days, now Chase Bank. About security issues and how you protect things behind armored glass and whatnot. And we're very serious about that, but it didn't stop the museum from actually going ahead and having this show.
Well, you seem to not mind confronting things. Both that, I mean, in the new book, basically you confront sociobiology, evolutionary psychology, a great deal of what is discussed as sort of certain the claim that in some sense that biological evolution has determined many of your behavior characteristics. In fact, you basically discount that completely, as far as I can see. And I found something that, well, there's a lot in there that caused me to think about this. One really interesting point you make about children is that sure, we all have the same genetic, Homo sapiens, the same basic genetic makeup. So as an infant, we're capable of learning any language. But yet by the time we're 5 years old, we've already learned not only a language, but a set of beliefs and values and prejudices that largely define who we are. And moreover, they can be completely different than the beliefs, values, and prejudices and language of another infant. So in some sense, they're almost two cultural species that are distinct. We may be biological species, but if you want to talk about what you define, other than it being able to procreate, what a species might be, they're essentially two different species. And so that culture, in some sense, overwhelmingly determines how we act.
Yeah, no, that's the great conundrum of trying to define what we are as humans, because we all are born with the capacity to become an adult human in whatever way, shape, or manner or form it happens to us. But by the time that we're not that old, we are culturally more distinctive from people on the other side of the world than most species, primate species are from each other, and yet we're all in the same species. So what being human means is to have a capacity to believe all kinds of things. And all this feeds back into the fact that everybody makes the world in their own mind and in their own way. Other species live in the world pretty much as nature presents it to them, and sometimes they react to it in very sophisticated ways, as indeed elephants and chimpanzees and so on do. But nothing else really remakes the world. We sort of disassemble the world into a vocabulary of symbols that words are the classic example of these symbols, and reassemble them in our minds. And we live in the world in which we reassembled in our minds, really much more than we live in the actual world that is out there.
Well, I get the sense that when I've been reading your recent work, that's your answer to the question, what the origin of human uniqueness is, this symbolic reasoning. In a sense, it reminiscent of ideas, at least that I've discussed with Noam Chomsky, that the ability in his minimalist interpretation, the ability to take a few variables and and basically add on to them means you have an infinite with a few simple things. You can create an infinite number of sentences, and therefore there's an incredible world of possibilities out there, and that symbolic notion, which presumably I think you would argue is what came about somehow around 100,000 years ago, is what changed everything.
Yeah, I think that's key to how it happened so quickly. Because basically, Noam is saying that there is a very, very small algorithmic change gives you this amazing emergent result. And it's what is extraordinary is not the change itself so much as the result. And I think that's very key. I think where we would tend to, Noam really is the first person who really drew attention to the fact that language is a portal to thought, just as much as it is to communication.
As he says, it's more, not just as much; it's even more important. Language was created not to communicate, but to affect the way we think.
Yeah, indeed, that's what he would say, and. I think that language and thought are too intimately intertwined to say that one is more important than the other. And Noam would say we were thinking before we were speaking or before we were using articulate language. I think the two came in a feedback with each other because I can't see how the cycle could possibly have started without something like that. Because
of this claim that basically... there's a genetic basis that made the Homo sapiens, but once we had symbolic thought, that basically changed everything. It was a sea change, and it will be a sea change for a variety of reasons we'll get into. But our evolutionary success means that we will not undergo the same biological stresses or selection effects that would produce speciation, as we'll talk about. But it reminded me, I couldn't help but thinking, it reminded me of Rousseau in some sense, that we're born free but live forever in chains. That the freedom of this infant, we have this biological basis, but the minute we're embedded in a culture, that creates a set of chains that literally govern our thought processes, more importantly, the way we behave more than any other thing, that we are changed by our culture. Yeah, I think that is absolutely the case, and there's no question about it. But once that infant has become an adult, it can still make choices. He or she can still make choices, and we retain an element of free will as an adult, though probably we don't have as kids because we're just absorbing other people's values when we're kids. As adults, we can step back and look at situations and make our own judgments and maybe even act on those judgments. And that is what I would think of as being free will. We can make choices. Well, for all intents and purposes, we can make choices. There may be many factors that go into it that one could argue that there's a deterministic effect in our. Well, those are the chains, but I don't think it's deterministic. Well, in any more sense, I mean, when you have so many factors, very small things can. It's hard to predict. It may, in fact, literally impossible to predict in advance. But there may be many factors that go into it, maybe that affect our decision making that we may not be aware of. But if there's so many, it's like the fly the butterfly and its wings. It can produce some small effect if there's chaos and many factors that we can't predict what you're going to do in advance. So effectively, it seems like free will in any case. Yeah, well, the thing is that the only ironclad law of human existence probably is the law of unintended consequences, right? So we are this paradox. I mean, humans are just a bundle of contradictions, and what they do leads to contradictory things. We're not talking about any kind of perfected organism here. Yeah, well, there's a few key facts that it seems to me you're trying to dispel. Some of them wisdom in the field, and some of them is misunderstanding of the nature of natural selection and evolution. One of I've had this debate, in fact, with a number of people, is the notion that somehow evolution is directed towards perfect. It's got a goal, and there's a perfection down there, and there's improvements, and of course that's not the case at all. Maybe you want to elaborate.
No, I think it certainly is the case. Evolution is just a matter of what works at any time. And, I spent a lot of my career offending evolutionary psychologists and whatnot. And quite honestly, in this book, I wanted to get away from that. I didn't even want to mention evolutionary psychology.
Well, you did,
but I did because I had a co-author and who feels very much the same way that I do, and wanted to express it in his way. And I was eventually happy to go along with this.
The two things you really hit on are, as I say, sociobiology. The sense that our social predilections and decision making is determined by genetics, and evolutionary psychology, that certain quote unquote universal facets of human culture are also determined, at least by our evolutionary basis rather than our cultural basis. And by evolutionary basis, I mean a biological basis that can be traced in some way to our genetic heritage. And one of the examples you talk about, which is interesting to me because I've talked about this in a different context and it caused me to rethink this, is the notion of religion. The fact that religion is ubiquitous in human society seems to suggest that there's some biological need for religion, and you counter that. So maybe you could sort of.
Well, human society is very complex, and I think that religion certainly answers to the kind of need that societies have. Interestingly, yes, all societies have some notion of religion, whether it's organized or not. Maybe we should say spirituality as a more generalized thing.
I just hate that word. But okay.
Within every society, there are also people, of course, who are not having any of it.
Yeah.
And the fact that organized religion is extremely suited to the kind of power structure that you have to have in societies, I think, is a very significant reason for why it is so widespread. It's something that helped societies to do whatever it was they had to do.
So in a sense, because all humans live in societies, it turns out to be an independently discovered, an effective way of controlling power structures within that society, rather than biological. It's the circumstance of the fact that humans live in social groups.
Well, it's biologically a result of the fact that we are able to conceive of things that we haven't seen and that we haven't heard of and that we can't touch. So you biologically have to have that human capacity, which I think is basically that symbolic capacity.
So that's where you say, in some sense, seems to me that's where you say biology ends or genetics ends. Somehow the genetic structure of humans produced a structure which produced a brain that had symbolic reasoning, and after that, that's it.
I think you're absolutely right there. I think that basically the capacity is what underpins everything else. It's what makes everything else possible. But the way in which that capacity is exploited, the way in which things are pursued, differs from place to place. And it differs according to probably so many different factors that you could barely begin to model them.
Well, and a big part of your book is this bell curve notion, the fact that there's variances within a population, and that part of that, in some sense, demonstrates the non-biological nature of how societies work, because people can pick up on, at that time, in that cultural time, what works and what doesn't. And it's no more, the fact that religion is ubiquitous is no more surprising, perhaps, than the fact that there are many other ways that organisms, including human organisms, have independently come up to solve problems. I thought, I can't help but poetically notice that in the book you mentioned the fact that beer is produced from rice in one place and barley in another, but it's an independent solution. And since contemporaneously with this book, you produced a book called The Natural History of Beer, I wondered if that was on your mind when you did it.
Well, I think that that particular phrase was written as a result of having been thinking about beer. But the books were published almost at the same time, but they were written quite far apart in time because trade publishers tend to act much more quickly than the university publishers do.
Yes. But you specifically argue very strong against people who claim there's a gene for religion or a gene for homosexuality. And it's worth, I'd like to give you a chance to expand upon that because you'll do better than me. I mean, I read the book, but because one thing I want to ask about this is you present a series of cogent arguments, and I know part of it is you're trying to aim at, and as they do in the last part of the book, to talk about possible solutions for societal problems that are, to argue that we're not genetically determined to destroy ourselves or not. But I wonder how much pushback you're getting from colleagues on this.
Well, the book just came out, so
but your ideas presumably have been you've been promoting ideas among colleagues for some time, I guess.
Well, we've been independently, talking about issues that have to do with the degree to which behaviors may be inherited, for a long time. And, clearly this has not made us very popular with the people who believe that we are adapted to to an environment that for some reason no longer exists. And that we therefore behave inappropriately. It's a very nice sort of out for you to say, oh yes, well we have infidelity because we're condemned to have it by our genes. This is just one of the other choices, one of the choices we have to make, but
there's more scientific basis for your arguments against, say, a gay gene or a religious gene, and I think it's probably, I'd like to give you some time to sort of elaborate on them here.
Well, there is a tendency that we have very reductionist minds. Human beings are storytellers.
I notice that you constantly harp against reductionism as a particle physicist who's tried to. Well, I mean, in physics it works pretty darn well, and so. But your argument is that this notion of reductionism, reducing everything to our genes, is
well, we have
misplaced.
reductionist minds, and because that is the way the mind likes to work, and that's great for you physicists, right? It's not so great for anybody who's trying to understand.
So let me just put it this way: would you say reductionism is biological?
I would say
you said that's the way the mind likes to work.
I think a tendency towards favoring reductionist explanations is sort of inherent in the way in which our minds are organized, which is basically biological. But we're talking again, we're not talking about specifics of expression of this tendency. We're talking about the origin of the tendency itself.
Yeah. Okay, but go on. So I interrupt you. So reductionism means we tend to want to have relate a one-to-one relationship between, say, genes and behavior.
Exactly, and that's what it boils down to in the case of human beings. In any case, and we like to be able to find a simple, straightforward, direct explanation of one thing giving rise to something else, and we are entertained by that kind of notion, but it's often very, very misleading. Because, in fact, things are much more complicated than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you give evidence of that, right?
We do. I mean, we pile up, a certain amount of evidence. When we look at this, the evidence that has, these studies are difficult to do, but the relating of behaviors to genes on a genome-wide basis, and this usually reveals that that we think, are the basis of what makes us unique. There's usually about a 50-50 split between environmental and genomic effects. On the other hand, if you try to quantify the contribution of particular genes, you usually find that the top, the top 100 or so genes that are associated with particular behaviors only account for a tiny percentage of all the variation that you see out there. So there's a genetic predisposition that underlies all our behaviors, but that the expression of those behaviors is a function of many, many, many more things and many, many, many genes. And genes live in an incredibly complex environment. Richard Dawkins, you just mentioned, was very happy to look for genes for this and for that and for the other thing. But genes actually don't act alone. And you cannot really change one thing, in the genome without affecting many, many, many other things at the same time. So every change there is in that genomic equilibrium involves a trade-off of some kind or another. And that's been actually known for many, many years. Eric Lenneberg wrote about it in the context of neurolinguistics back, half a century ago.
I was perfectly happy to sort of buy the argument that ultimately genetics, if you knew the genetic makeup of a human being, you'd know, and you had infinite computer power, you'd basically be able to determine the people they were and how they behave. But one of the things that sort of struck me immediately as arguing against that is the work that's been done on the microbiome, on the fact that ultimately when I think I'm making decisions of what I want, that the microbes in my gut seem to have as much of an impact on my decision making and my character and not only what I like to eat or not as anything else.
Yeah, there's certainly we are every one of us as an individual human being is actually an ecosystem, and we're affected by all the components in that ecosystem. And again, those components are so varied and diverse that it's very, very hard to single out the action of any one of them. It's very, very rarely that you can impute anything in this realm to, say, a single gene or to a single cause of any kind.
People often ask, well, if we're evolving, what's the next step? And you point out that culture, that something that is well known, that culture has changed everything, and not just that, the density of humans on Earth has changed everything. But you do make some statements that. So there's a quote that you give right at the beginning of the book, which I found fascinating, and I can see in the context of where you're heading about our future and talking about the nature of choice. You say what the quote is, part of being human is the inhumanity of it.
That's exactly right. I mean, I thought we begin the book with this quote because this is essentially the theme that humans are paradoxical creatures. Humans are bundles of contradiction, and there's just as much of what we would call inhumanity in the world as produced by humans as there is humanity. And that's another thing that sort of contributes, another illustration of this sort of bell curve effect that you've already mentioned. That everything that humans do is counterbalanced at the other end of the distribution by things that other people do. Or you could be humane and inhumane in the same day. It's an extraordinary thing. We are these bundles of paradoxes. You're not the same person when you go to bed at night as you were when you get up in the morning. Humans are constantly in flux, but what you can guarantee is that we're going to be inconsistent.
There's a great quote somewhere in the book that I thought I wrote down that exactly that. Basically everything. Every time you generalize and say humans will behavior will respond this way, there's a counterexample.
Yeah,
and often in individuals on a daily basis.
Yeah. I think one thing I was reading a biography of James Boswell once, who was of course Samuel Johnson's biographer, and the guy who wrote the blurb on the back of the book, or the summary of the book, the teaser, was citing all the contradictions in Boswell's character traits.
Yeah,
and I thought, oh my gosh, this is the human condition he's describing right here. This isn't James Boswell. This is humanity.
Like, wonderful father,
right?
Whoring, whatever.
That's right.
It just goes on and on. And pedant who writes the best biography ever. I mean, it's sort of
right.
It was a wonderful example.
Tedious doggerel and author of the most powerful biography in the language.
I'm not sure I want to quote the blurb in the modern. If I ask for a blurb, I'm not sure I'd want that one.
You want half of it.
Yeah, if I get to choose the half, but. I found there are two quotes in here which I wrote down, which seem to be, are they consistent? One was, every individual is a sum of his or her genetic predispositions. Mm-hmm. And another is that nothing in the fossil record exists that can predict who we are. So how can I reconcile those two things?
Well, I think that basically the solution is in this phenomenon of emergence, where you put two unrelated things together and then something completely different emerges. Human behavior is certainly an emergent thing that would never have been predicted from anything that we see before in the archaeological record. I think in the archaeological record we see an increasing sophistication among our predecessors, our precursors. They're getting better and better at exploiting the environment. They're developing more and more sophisticated technologies, not continually, but in a sort of stepwise way. They're becoming more complex creatures, but they're becoming more complex along a certain trajectory. And then suddenly, when our predecessors began to behave in a symbolic manner, all hell broke loose, and all the rules changed, as you said. It's literally a change in the rules. And that is because of an emergent quality that gives rise to this symbolic ability to reconstitute the world in our heads and imagine it can be other than it is. And since we've got clever hands, we can do something about that.
The question, if I try and be generous and expand the notion of evolutionary psychology to certain general predispositions that give rise to a whole slew of different behaviors, could there be a predisposition to solving problems in a certain way, or certainly the predisposition to living in social groups, to creating effective social groups, so that there is a genetic basis to, and it seems to me that your whole discussion is based on the fact that we live in social groups, and those social groups have evolved. Another milestone, as far as I can see in the development of Homo sapiens at least, is the shift from hunter-gatherer to living in agricultural communities, which produces a whole bunch of different stresses, social stresses, and you might say environmental stresses that change the way we behave.
Yeah. Well, that too is entirely emergent. And of course, you become, once you've switched your trajectory, you're kind of a prisoner of that, until the next emergent thing happens. But yeah, I am certainly not here to knock evolutionary psychology. I think the really cool thing that evolutionary psychologists are doing, whether or not the initial assumption that behaviors are driven by genes is true, it has led them to look at human behaviors in great detail and in a structured kind of a way. And it has led them to learn a great deal about the regularities in human behavior and what can be predicted about human behavior and maybe what can't. And I think that's an extremely valuable thing. So, on balance, I'm very happy to have evolutionary psychology around. And I'm not here to say that it's a bill of goods at all.
Well, but I guess what you would say is that the range of behavior that can be predicted is small compared to the range of behavior that can't be. Or at least the prediction is based more, that if you were going to make predictions, you'd based it more on the culture in which someone is living than on any evolutionary history to arrive at that culture?
Well, there's a history of diversification of cultures. And cultural evolution is which basically we're if current demographic conditions continue to obtain, we're not going anywhere biologically, but we're certainly going somewhere culturally. And what happened 100,000 years ago is that we acquired a capacity that we began to explore at that time. And that exploration has led us through this transition out of hunting gathering into sedentary lifestyles. It's led us to literacy, it's led us to rockets to the moon. It's led us to all kinds of things, and we've got no idea where this stops. We don't know if we're, if it's an exhaustible capacity or an inexhaustible one. It's really, really, really exciting to be exploring this.
There's an interesting part of a chapter where you talk about the future of evolution. People's claims about, in the future we're going to have big brains, big heads. We're going to be, progressively lighter in our bones, and maybe we won't be able to walk. And those arguments are based on, once again, this notion that some natural selection is affecting us. And your point is that doesn't work at all. Maybe you could explain why.
Well, I think that what we tend to do anytime we predict the future is first thing we do, we look at the past. And the temptation is to predict the future by extrapolating what we find in the past. And certainly when we look at our own past, we find a very strong tendency. We find our brains have been getting bigger, among our precursors for a long time. They were obviously interacting in the world in more and more complex ways. There is a distinct trajectory there. The only thing is it's thrown off at the last minute by our new way of manipulating information in the brain. Since when, by the way, the human brain has gotten smaller. We're famous for having smaller brains than Neanderthals. We also actually have smaller brains than the Homo sapiens who lived at the same time as Neanderthals and were still behaving like Neanderthals. But once we started behaving in this new way, using a new mental algorithm, which turns out presumably to have been more frugal metabolically, we found out we didn't need so much brain, and brains have gotten smaller because they're an expensive thing to have. If you don't need a big brain, you're not going to have one.
The other situation that I found impressive was the fact that, that so-called trajectory of evolution was a fallacy, but it's also not that there's a continual progression, but there are these sharp shifts that, again, depend on cultural circumstances, the ebbs and flows of climate, for example, that produce immediate changes, but then are addressed culturally and may not, therefore, represent a future change.
Well, now they are. But if you look back into the past, there were basically 4 major technological shifts. And, technology is what we have a record of in the material record and we can look at. I mean, it's only a tiny, tiny reflection of what the entire social and cultural situations were. But technology, we do have a record in the form of stone tools. We have the first stone tools. Well, let's not worry about arguable things that are very old, but definitely stone tools made in the way in which we think of stone tools regularly being made about 2.5 million years ago. It's a very simple thing. You take one lump of stone, a river cobble, and you whack another cobble with it, and you get a sharp flake if you do it right. Which is not so easy, you get a sharp flake. And you can use that flake for cutting, and it doesn't matter what it looks like, no matter how big it is, how small it is, it's the sharp edge that counts. For 1 million years, people made stone tools basically like that. For a whole 1 million years, the concept of stone tool making didn't change. And then at about 1.6 million years ago, with a little outlier back to 1.78, but that's an outlier. People started making tools to a particular shape. They started making what they call a hand axe, which is you take a lump of rock and you shape it very carefully with multiple blows on both sides until you get this big teardrop-shaped implement. And that was obviously a very successful implement, and that continued to be made right up until about 160,000 years ago. And then at about 300,000 years before the hand axe dropped out, the next kind of conceptually new stone tool came in. And that was the prepared coarse stone tool, where you carefully shaped a lump of rock again with multiple blows on both sides, and you prepare a platform and whack, and then whack the resulting thing and get off a big flake with the cutting edge all the way around the periphery, continuous cutting edge. So here we're talking about a period of 2.5 million, or nearly 2.5 million years, with only 3 technological changes. Now, suddenly, when Homo sapiens comes along and starts behaving in a what's called a symbolic way, suddenly that pattern of highly episodic change completely disappears, and people are making stone tools, in their own fashion, and within 50,000 years, you've got the computer.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I think you make the claim, and I assume I was trying to think if I believe it. Maybe dogs might be different, but they've been engineered. You said there's no other species that resembles less what it looked like 2.5 million years ago than humans.
It's true.
And that is simply because of the cultural evolution of the last 50,000 years. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that the first Homo sapiens who looked just like us were behaving like their predecessors, but they had come a tremendously long way in their physical structure that we can pick up in the fossil record. This is a separate question. Humans have changed radically in 2 million years in a way in which no other lineage of mammal seems to have done in that particular period anyway. And that radical physical change is something quite extraordinary, but it's independent. It's independent from this change in the way in which we manipulate information in our minds that occurred suddenly about 100,000 years ago. That's a separate event. And we became, at that point, culturally different.
And so we now, I think people often say, well, and that's another argument people use against evolution. Well, if you look at evolution, how come, in survival of the fittest, how come we behave the way they are? And of course, the point is that culture dominates. We are thinking beings, culture dominates. And as you know, for a long time, altruism was a lot of people said, how can you explain altruism if it's survival of the fittest? And there's lots of arguments genetic arguments why altruism is a good thing.
People tie themselves in knots because they want a reductionist explanation.
And your argument is, they're not in a cultural sense. There's a reason for a thinking species that could imagine a future to be altruistic that has nothing necessarily to do with any natural selection that occurred before.
No, what I'm saying is that basically altruism and selfishness, belong on the same curve.
Yeah,
and that altruism is simply a outlier on this curve of what you call, I don't know, cooperation, or however you might want to put it. You've got saints. On altruistic saints on the one end, and you have selfish monsters on the other end, and most of us are somewhere in the middle.
And so that arguing trying to argue for the extremes, you don't need genetics to argue for the extremes. You just need variability.
Yeah. You don't need a special explanation for altruism. It's one of the things that is available to people. People can be altruistic. They can be selfish.
And so there's a universe of possibilities made possible because of symbolic thinking.
Exactly.
And we exploit all of them.
Because we can make the choices.
We can make choices, but social systems select. I mean, as you say, religion may be selected by social systems because it allows that group of people. It's not a genetic selection, but it's to effectively have a power structure that works well when compared to other power structures.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, cultural evolution is just as much a huge evolutionary experiment as biological.
And it's certain, but the difference is it's so much faster. It's so much faster.
It is as fast as it can spread laterally within a generation in a way in which genes can't.
And well, you argue, and I think not just you, but in general, that because of our evolutionary success, the whole notion of speciation for humans is just out the window. We're not because speciation requires certain conditions which no longer exist in humanity. Maybe you want to talk about that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's and this is entirely independent of culture.
Yeah.
The fact that we can't expect speciation derives from the fact that we have a gigantic population in the world, closing in on 8 billion people, packed cheek to jowl across the entire habitable surface of the world. While we were evolving, our predecessors lived in tiny populations that were scattered in little population nuclei over gigantic landscapes, and they were living in demographic conditions that were very highly conducive to a lot of to evolutionary change. Now those conditions for evolutionary change do not exist anymore. You can't frog march a huge population down any one biological direction. The genetic inertia within very large populations is just too great.
The idea that from Darwin's discovery of finches in different islands is that in order to have speciation, you need to have a population that's first of all that's separate from other populations, relatively small. So some mutation can fortuitously, if you wish, dominate that population, and then they're separated. So eventually they become sexually incompatible, among other things.
No, that's it. That's certainly true for mammals such as ourselves. There are other organisms have different mechanisms, but mammals like us, yes, we have to have isolation before we can have speciation.
Now, I didn't read this in your book at all, but I've heard the argument given that there is a route for speciation for humanity, and some people are excited about it. When we send small groups to Mars, let's say, if we do, and I'm dubious in the near term, that those groups there's not going to be a lot of back and forth because going back and forth is just hard and difficult, and so we will have a small group of that we will send to another planet, and over time that could speciate. What do you think of that?
In theory, that's absolutely correct. All you need is a small genetically unstable population to incorporate genetic novelties, which are naturally going to arise because of the mutation that is constantly going on in the genome. So yes, theoretically it's true, but how are you going to keep that population, alive without some kind of a lifeline and connection to Mother Earth?
Well, I think
it's going to be tough.
It's going to be tough. Well, maybe, but I think it might be tougher to have that lifeline than actually to have it's the travel back and forth that's the problem. So
anyway, travel back and forth, and you've got you have the problem of maintaining a population on Mars with Martian resources.
Well, it's all science fiction. I think. Yeah, right. I think people's notions that Mars is going to be, we're going to get there and we're going to be able to survive and have a functioning. I think it's largely science fiction.
Yeah. But if you could get a small population on Mars, and it could somehow establish itself and exist in isolation from Homo sapiens, all bets would be off. Yeah.
So enough about humans. Let's talk about beer, what really matters. So to be fair, you wrote a book
meaning of life.
Yeah, the meaning of life. Right. That's right. Beer, the universe, and everything. But to be fair, you wrote a book also called The Natural History of Wine. But first of all, which do you prefer, beer or wine?
That's a really good question. I guess I've been drinking beer longer than I've been drinking wine, but probably not very much longer. We did the book on Natural History of Wine, and after it was published, I sort of stopped drinking wine, not in anticipation of the of the beer book, but we had to do a lot of research for the beer book. That was
you drinking a lot.
Yeah. Well, you have to. Beer is a very cultural thing, know, and beer culture is something to behold, and so we went to Oktoberfest. for example, and that was one of the most eye-opening cultural experiences I've had in a very long time. And we've been drinking a lot of beer, and fortunately, 30 years ago, there was not much interesting beer around, if any. Mm-hmm. And if you'd asked me this question, whether I preferred beer or wine, 30 years ago, I would have unhesitatingly said wine. Much more interesting, much more diversity, much more to entertain the palate. But boy, craft beer brewing in the United States particularly has become so creative and so inventive in the last 10 or 20 years that you cannot any longer, I think, argue that intrinsically wine is more interesting than beer. Beer's offering many, many, many different things now. And in a way, it's, beer is a product of its maker more than wine is.
Yeah.
Wine is supposed to have terroir. Wine is supposed to be an expression of place. But in the case of beer, it's really the expression of the maker. Right?
It's a creation that's not. It's not dependent on the grapes as much as the process.
Right. So in winemaking, the winemaker is supposed to get out of the way and let the wine make itself. Yeah. That's the traditional sort of expression. But beer is down to the beer maker.
And it's. I mean, by the way, I live in Portland, and if you visited there, I've been told Portland has more per capita craft beers than any other place in the world. I know that every time there's a new thing in the newspaper, there's a new beer created with the name of that event in the newspaper. So.
Oh yeah, well, it's really a beer vana that you have there in Portland, no question. Although I think Asheville, North Carolina, makes an argument for having more breweries per capita of the population.
I see that in a lot of things where these claims are made. But so first question is, which goes back further in time in human history, beer or wine?
That's a really interesting question, and the answer is nobody is sure. But the very first alcoholic beverages that we know have the characteristics both of beer and of wine. Interestingly enough, the very earliest alcoholic beverage, I think, is from China, and it's 9,000 years old. And it's known from chemical residues on the inside of pots. And those pots had contained a liquid that had some cereal in it, had rice, it had honey, and it had fruit from hawthorn. So it had some of the characteristics of beer, some of the characteristics of mead, and some of the characteristics of wine. So what they call extreme beers now are sort of going back in that direction. That's kind of a return to the origins.
A return to the origins. Do you think there's I can't help but ask this, do you think there's a genetic predilection to want to have beer?
Well, there's a very interesting thing is they've just, humans have a unusual tolerance for alcohol, much more than most mammals and much more than most primates. And it turns out that the mutation in the alcohol dehydrogenase gene that allows us to tolerate much more alcohol than most primates occurred in the lineage that led to the African apes and humans, maybe at around 10 million years ago. So it's not just humans that have this; it's chimpanzees have it as well.
But there's no examples of chimpanzees making fermenting, as far as right?
There's no example of chimpanzees making fermented beverages, but there is an example of chimpanzees stealing fermented beverages.
Oh, really? What happens when they do?
Well, there's a plantation in a place called Bossou in Guinea in West Africa. There's a place where they have a plantation of raffia palms. Right? And raffias are these big, expansive palm trees from Madagascar, and you can make palm toddy from them by binding together the stems that give rise to the fruit, and taking the sap that drips from them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the plantation workers were making toddy for themselves, but they had to be away working most of the day, and the chimpanzees would sneak in. And very interestingly, what they would do, they couldn't get their hands into the containers that the palm toddy was dripping into, and get enough out. So what they did was they took leaves, chewed on the leaves to make a sponge, dipped the sponge in the liquid, and then helped themselves to the toddy. And they'd be dipping 10 times a minute sometimes, for quite some time.
Necessity being the mother of invention.
Yeah.
Well, I want to head towards thinking about the future as we conclude our discussion a little bit, by alternating between optimism and pessimism. So if part of being human is the inhumanity of being human, and if humans have a bell curve, so that whatever behavior we want, there's always an awful part of it, as well as a quote good part, and you can define those things in whatever ways you want.
Right.
It certainly suggests that awful behavior will persist, and in fact, we see evidence. And produce results which work against, which is sort of anti-select for our own future, from climate change to other things. But you argue not only effectively by choice, but I found a quote near the end of your book when I began to feel like doomsday was around the corner in reading your book, or thinking I often do anyway. I found this quote in an Assyrian clay tablet from 2800 BC.
Right.
Which I just love this quote now. I can't believe it. So it's inscribed with the following gloomy inscription. Our earth is degenerate in these latter days. There are signs that the world is speedily coming to an end. Bribery and corruption are common. Children no longer obey their parents. Every man wants to write a book, and the end of the world is evidently approaching. I just love that in 2800 BC. Somehow we've survived past that. So maybe predicting doomsday in the near future is also equally inappropriate.
There is certainly something to this. Human beings, and in fact, the biosphere itself, has turned out to be a lot more resilient than perhaps we might think. But yes, there is a tendency, I think, to have a bit of gloom and doom, and the doomsayers are always with us. But then the Pollyannas are out there as well, and as usual, human experience is going to turn out to be somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Now, but I think you try and end an optimistic note that we have the choice, that nothing, in the words of Lawrence of Arabia, nothing is written. That we have a choice, and we have a range of intelligence and a range of choices and behaviors, and that therefore it's not clear that we can predict the future in that regard, and that there's hope, I guess, is what you're saying.
Well, the only thing I can predict is that if we screw up, we'll only have ourselves to blame.
Yeah.
Right? As to what is going to happen,
namely, we won't have genetics to blame, is what you're saying.
And we can't blame genetics for our present. And I don't think we're going to be able to blame genetics for the future. I think we are as a species sufficiently mature to make informed choices, and it's only if we don't make those choices that things are necessarily going to go adrift.
Well, look, I think that's a wonderful way to sum up part of our discussion, and to actually sum up what we're trying to do. Informed choices, you would argue, are our hope. And for me, having informed discussions like this, so fortune certainly favors the prepared mind. And it's wonderful to be able to have these discussions to prepare our minds to think about what we are as humans. And ultimately, one of the purposes of all intellectual activity is to review and reflect upon ourselves and reassess our place in the cosmos. Oh. And I've certainly been spurred, not only in the past, but now in the present, by discussions with you to think about what it means to be human. And I want to thank you for coming to talk about that.
Well, it's been a lot of fun. I wish I'd talked to you about this book before I wrote it.
Thanks.
The Origins podcast is produced by Lawrence Krauss, Nancy Dahl, John and Don Edwards, Gus and Luke Holwerda, and Rob Zepps. Audio by Thomas Amison. Web design by Redmond Media Lab. Animation by Tomahawk Visual Effects. And music by Rickolas. To see the full video of this podcast, as well as other bonus content, visit us at patreon.com/originspodcast.